Kim Philby, Britain's anti-James Bond. Kim Philby is probably Britain's most famous, his colleagues denying his communist ideals while rising to the top of MI6 and defecting to the Soviet Union in 1963. He was born before World War I in Punjab, India, where his parents were stationed. His father was a member of the Indian Civil Service, a well-known author and Muslim, and later became a civil servant in Mesopotamia and advisor to King Ibn Saud of Saud. But he wasn't truly involved with the Soviet intelligence service until after graduation. Philby moved to Vienna in the early Litzy Friedman, a young Jewish communist from Austria. Philby liked her determination and strong political conviction. They got married and fled Austria in 1934 prior to the start of World War II. Coincidentally, the same year, an NKVD Russian secret police agent, Arnold Deutsch, was sent to London and managed to get in contact with Litzy regarding the recruitment of Solent's Park. The man described himself as Otto, but Philip found out much later from an MI5 file that the man was indeed Arnold Deutsch. From that moment on, Philip began feeding information to the Soviet Union. His first task for Otto was giving a list of names of those he met at Cambridge who might respond to discreet contact. While Philby himself states that it was his time in Cambridge where he became involved with communism, it was Litzy who got him in touch with the Soviet Secret Service. Philby travelled to Spain in 1937. Krivitsky was, probably not surprisingly, shot in a Washington hotel room a year later. Philby then moved up in a huge coup for the Soviet intelligence, as it gave Philby access to highly sensitive documents just in time for the start of the Cold War. In this position he was well able to protect his old Cambridge 5 buddies, Blunt, Burgess and McLean, and he also informed his Soviet handlers about Konstantin Volkov, a Soviet diplomat who was informing London about Soviet spies working in the British Foreign Office. Volkov was arrested by the KGB, interrogated and subsequently executed. At the height of the Cold War, Philby was posted to the communist Soviet-leaning regime of Enver Hoxha. Philby leaked the information to the Soviet Union, and the operation failed, with many would have attempted the same in countries like Bulgaria, after which he believes the Soviet Union would have become involved, leading to a press conference to deny he was a communist, quite against his nature, as he had spent most of his life trying to avoid publicity at all times. He told Elliot he had been half expecting to see him. Elliot confronted him, saying, "I once looked up to you, Kim. My God, how I despise